So I'm delighted to have you all here today for what promises to be a compelling conversation on a topic which I hope all of you will have much to say about as well, which is reason versus passion in politics. I want to thank the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, which helps to make the Big Thinking Lecture Series possible. Also, we're very pleased this morning to have partnered with the Trudeau Foundation to create this event. And with that, I'd like to introduce Jennifer Petrella, who is the Director of Mentorship, Fellowship, and Public Interaction with the Trudeau Foundation. She's going to introduce our speaker this morning.
Merci beaucoup, Lisa. Merci beaucoup aussi à la Fédération de nous avoir invités ce matin et d'avoir invité notre lauréat, Joseph Heath. So the Canadian Federation for the Humanities and Social Sciences actually has quite a bit in common with the Pierre, Elliot Trudeau Foundation. We're a nonpartisan charitable organization that was founded after the death of the late Prime Minister to support the most innovative and publicly engaged Canadian academics working on social issues that really matter. So every year we support about 45 doctoral students studying in Canada and abroad. We have a mentorship program where we pair up those scholars with renowned Canadians who have contributed to public life in this country. We hold an annual conference every year on an issue that is important and timely. And we name 4 to 5 fellows each year. So senior Canadian academics such as law scholars, Kent Roach and Rod MacDonald have been fellows. International experts like Jennifer Welsh and Janice Stein, and philosophers like Joseph Heath. So I'm going to tell you all a story about when U of T nominated Joe in 2011. I remember when that happened. The universities usually submit a photograph of their candidate, suit and tie, nice outfit. Here came a photograph of Joe in a white T-shirt with a messenger bag strapped across his chest. I thought to myself, U of T, we've asked you to nominate profs, and you're sending us students. What's going on? In fact, though, when I started to read the dossier, I realized that who they had sent us was one of the Faculty of Arts' most popular lecturers, a prolific researcher and author, someone who had written at that point 2 academic books, 3 popular works, and by popular I mean the genre, and also these were bestsellers, and dozens of articles on business ethics, ethics in public administration, intergenerational equality, morality, Habermas, the welfare state, and other subjects. Very interesting. As I began to read through some of this material, I realized that there was a common thread in Joe's work. He always wanted to address fundamental questions of injustice in a market-dominated society. And as I continued to read, I realized that, in fact, we had in front of us somebody who was rather exceptional, somebody who studied social phenomena with rigor and with depth. We'd seen that before. But somebody who also proposed very innovative solutions that seemed like, to me, that they would be feasible and that they had a true impact. In fact, by the time I was done, I realized that Joe takes further than anyone else I know the famous quote by Oscar Wilde, "The best way to get rid of temptation is to yield to it." Because what he does is he takes selfishness, greed, self-centeredness, laziness, all of our most wonderful human qualities, and he finds a way to turn them to the common good. It's an extraordinary feat, and I know that this morning's speech will be just as extraordinary. So thank you all for coming, and it is with great pleasure that I give to you the Director of the Centre for Ethics at the University of Toronto, a professor in the Department of Philosophy in the School for Public Policy and Governance, and a 2012 Fellow of the Pierre, Elliot Trudeau Foundation, Professor Joseph Heath.
Well, thank you. Et merci d'avoir venu si nombreux. Merci à la Fédération et la Fondation. So today I'm going to talk about an old topic, but a good topic, namely the role of reason in politics. And the slogan obviously will be familiar to you at all, and so we're going to start where it all began, with Pierre Trudeau's slogan, "La raison avant la passion." So there's a slogan actually which could be translated in multiple ways in English. But this is the version that made it onto the quilt. This is the quilt that made it into the National Gallery, and so this is what we're going to work with. Reason over passion. Now, what I want to do, just to preface my remarks, is to remind you of what the issue was that led Trudeau Sr. to adopt this particular slogan. And so what motivated him in the late 60s to adopt this was that he was trying to defend federalism. Right? So it's important to the issue that he wanted to talk about. And so he had the sense that when it came to the struggle between federalism and sub-federal nationalism, that nationalism had a certain kind of advantage over federalism, particularly when nationalism is oriented around ethnic or linguistic solidarity. It has available to it a very, very strong emotional appeal. And federalism, by contrast, doesn't have the same kind of emotional resonance with people, right? It's difficult to get people as excited about federalism. Now, he thought that there was actually a principled reason for that. And so he said that it's because federalism is, quote, in its very essence, a compromise. And compromise is the kind of thing that doesn't have very, very strong visceral appeal. It's in the very nature of compromise. Right? The reason you compromise is because you think you're right and you think the other person's wrong. And so you fight about it, you argue about it, but over time you start to realize, you know what, this person thinks that she's right, and she thinks that I'm wrong. And you know what, the chances that she's going to change her mind are really limited. So, you know, maybe we could set aside the major issues and focus on these areas, or maybe despite the fact that we disagree about these big questions, we can nevertheless cooperate and so on. I mean, that's the line of reasoning that leads you to accept a compromise. And that fundamentally is a rational insight. That's not something which is available to you emotionally. So here's what Trudeau Sr. said. He said, quote, "Federalism has all along been a product of reason in politics. It was born of a decision by pragmatic politicians to face facts as they are, particularly the fact of the heterogeneity of the world's population." So, so that was written 50 years ago. That makes me feel old. Not many things make me feel old. That was a long time ago. So, all right. So what I want to do, actually, is I want to take that idea and that argument that was presented 50 years ago, and I want to try to update it a bit and to give you a sense of how it looks 50 years later, and in particular with developments and improvements that we have in psychology and cognitive science that give us a better ability to grasp that essential distinction that he was trying to draw. But the political message as well is one that we should not lose sight of. And so the thing he wanted to affirm was that there are certain kinds of debates which, if those debates are conducted at a highly emotional level, that tends to privilege certain positions. And that in a very, very emotionally charged debate, certain kinds of policy positions are going to be at an intrinsic disadvantage because those policy positions fundamentally are not motivated by emotion. They're motivated by rational insight. And so the thought was that the emotional tone of a debate is actually not neutral. It's not politically neutral, but rather it advantages certain kinds of positions. So the argument for why he wanted reason over passion was that he wanted a particular position to prevail, and it's a position that he felt you could only make the case for in the right kind of discourse, right? A discourse that privileges rationality. Okay, so I want to, the other thing about this slogan is if it weren't for the quilt, I think most of us would not even remember it, because this particular slogan didn't survive his first term in office. And he very explicitly gave up on it and adopted a sort of fight fire with fire response to nationalism. So again, one of the motivations, I think, for revisiting it is to ask the question of whether or not, despite the fact that it didn't have a strong track record of success, even in his own government, whether or not there wasn't something to that basic insight that certain kinds of debates can't be carried out on a purely emotional level. Okay, so now I want to talk about the way in which this view has been updated. And the first thing is that we have a sort of newfangled vocabulary now for talking about this. And so what he was trying to get at and with this distinction between reason and emotion is not the way in which we would be inclined to characterize the distinction now. Nowadays, we would draw a contrast between reason and intuition. So the core idea, though, is that we have within our minds two very different styles of cognition. Two very different ways of approaching and solving problems. So this is known as dual process theory. People who've read Daniel Kahneman's popular book, Thinking Fast and Slow, will be familiar with the basic outlines. Actually, so the names, and so we have these incredibly prosaic names now for, instead of reason and emotion, we also talk about System 1 and System 2. So I'm proud to say that that brilliant terminological innovation was actually due to a Canadian. My colleague at University of Toronto, Keith Stanovich, in OSC Psychology, was actually the person who invented, with I think a typically Canadian flair for the dramatic, decided to call them System 1 and System 2. And for some reason, those terms stuck. So nowadays, it's common in cognitive science to talk about reason as being System 2. So let me just describe briefly then the central characteristics of these different styles of cognition. And I'll start with reason. Okay, so reason is what we're doing right now. And so the first thing about reason is that it is linguistically based. And so I'm sitting here explaining to you an argument, and I'm presenting it in language. And the first thing to notice about it is that it takes a lot of time. So I've been going for, 5 minutes. I'm going to go for another 20 minutes. And, I'm barely getting a few ideas out there. Like, I'll put together maybe 6 ideas in a sequence. But it takes time to develop a rational argument. The second characteristic is that it's serial, which means, in the sense of a computer system, that is, one thought follows upon another. And so I've actually, on my third thought in a chain, I've got about 5 more to go, right? I'm putting them together into a sequence. And it's going to take me about 25 minutes to put all of those ideas together into a linear sequence. Other characteristic is that it's conscious. It's fully explicit. Now, what that means is not just that you're aware of the outcome. It's that every step of the argument is available to consciousness. And so by the time that I'm done, and you're amazed at my conclusion, you'll say, wow, how did we get there? You'll be able to go back and go through all the steps that led you to that conclusion, right? So all of the process of reasoning is explicit and conscious. And then finally, the last characteristic, and this is really important, is that it's effortful. It requires our concentration. And so right now, for example, as I try to reconstruct my argument for you, it's actually requiring my full attention. So I'm not in the back of my mind thinking about, how I'm hungry or what I want to eat for lunch or something like that, right? I'm fully concentrating on presenting this chain of reasoning to you. And you also have to pay attention to what I'm saying, and that requires effort. And at some point, you might drift off because it requires too much effort following what this guy's saying, right? And then you have to try to go back and catch the thread of the argument and so on. So reasoning has all of these characteristics. What we call intuition, it's misleading to call it a system. It's actually a huge collection of cognitive systems. But it's characterized primarily by not having any of these 4 characteristics. So the first characteristic is that it's extremely rapid cognition. And so the really classic examples we give of how intuition works are these sort of dedicated subroutines that we have for things like facial recognition. Right? So you pass somebody in the hall, and you have to decide, you've only got seconds to decide whether or not to greet this person. Right? So the question is, do I know this person? Right? And your brain just kind of magically tells you, like, you know this person. So you say, hi, how's it going? Right? Or your brain tells you, you don't know who that person is, and then you walk right past that person. Right? Now, that's actually, recognizing a face is infernally complicated. But your brain does it incredibly quickly. The other thing about it is that these systems run in parallel. They don't interfere with one another. So if you were to bump your coffee cup and it starts to fall off the table, you can grab the coffee cup. Or maybe your neighbor grabs the coffee cup. You have, again, that kind of lightning-fast ability to guess where the coffee cup is going and to snake your hand out and grab that coffee cup, right? Very, very fast cognition, but that does not interfere with other processes. So you could be having you could be recognizing a friend at the same time that you grab a coffee cup. Or you could walk and chew gum at the same time and so forth. Third, these processes are unconscious. And what that means is not that the result is unconscious, but how the result is generated is not available to consciousness. And that's what really characterizes intuition, is that we get the answer to a problem, but we actually have no idea how our brain solved that problem. So facial recognition, again, your brain just tells you, you know this person. But if you ask your brain, how did you figure that out? Your brain doesn't tell you. You have no idea what the system is. Right? Or think of, you look at a 10-year-old and you know that's a girl. But you ask yourself, how do I know that's a girl and not a boy? Like, what are the characteristics that allow us to tell the difference between male and female? Again, your brain doesn't tell you. Your brain has the ability to do it, but you don't have access to it. the conscious processing. I mean, that's why a lot of people are suspicious of intuition, precisely because we don't know how problems get solved. And finally, the intuition requires very low effort. And so it doesn't require the kind of effortful attention that you're giving me right now, right? To catch the coffee cup doesn't require a huge amount of effort. All right, so all of this combines to generate a psychological disposition, which is enormously significant, which Keith Stanovich just refers to as cognitive miserliness. And what it says basically is that our brains, our basic modus operandi in the world is that of cognitive laziness. So whenever we encounter a problem, we try to solve that problem in the least effortful way possible. And what that means is that we deploy System 1 resources first. Right? So we try to use these heuristic, rapid problem-solving techniques. And it's only if we're given some reason to suspect the answer, which is given to us by System 1, that we then kind of call a manager and sit down and then think about the problem. And I don't know about you, but I find as I get older, too, I get more System 1 dependent. That is, the thought of having to think about stuff. I don't know, like my kid wanted to play chess with me, and I'm like, oh, it's so hard playing chess. Like, you have to think so hard. Right? So it seems to me as you get older, I become more miserly with my resources of rationality because I have less energy for the kind of effort that it takes to solve problems explicitly. Okay, so some of you will be familiar with all of this. Malcolm Gladwell wrote a book about it. There's been, and then after he wrote his book, a whole bunch of other people wrote a whole bunch of other books. There's been like a deluge of literature of people talking about the amazing powers of intuition. And it is true that emotion, like back when Trudeau was writing in the 60s, there was often this sort of, emotion, So there was a kind of derogatory attitude towards emotion. And what we found about intuition is that intuition was sort of underestimated. It's actually a lot more powerful than we think it is. And interestingly enough, that realization came in particular out of artificial intelligence research. Because we started building computers, and we built computers to solve the problems that we find hard. And so things like, finding the square root of a 5-digit number is something that we find incredibly difficult. Doing long multiplication without pen and paper is something that we find very difficult. And so we built computers to do these difficult tasks for us. So for a computer, it's trivially simple to find a huge square root or what have you. And then, though, people made this assumption. They were like, well, look, hey, computers are doing all the hard stuff, so now all we have to do is program them to do the easy stuff, like learn English and walk and stuff like that. And then, ta-da, we're going to have artificial intelligence. So I don't know if you... So in the movie 2001, A Space Odyssey, for example, there's one point where you can see the nameplate on the HAL 9000 computer. And according to that nameplate, HAL was activated in 1992. So back in the 60s, they thought that by 1992, we were going to have like HAL 9000s running our spaceships, right? All right. So anybody who's tried to like talk to Siri on their phone knows that, we're not quite, at least they're not trying to kill us, but they also don't understand like basic questions, right? So artificial intelligence proved to be far more difficult than people thought it would be. The reason is that all of this stuff that intuition does is easy for us, but that doesn't mean it's easy in the grand scheme of things. In fact, why? Because this is our hardware, right? The System 1 stuff is the stuff that we are evolutionarily adapted to do. And our brains do it for us. They give us the results, but they don't tell us how we're doing it. So we experience it as being low effort. But in fact, from a computational perspective, it's incredibly difficult. So something like facial recognition is unbelievably difficult, which is why facial recognition software is at such a primitive level, right? And the way in which the human brain does it is almost miraculous. So my wife is like crazy about this. She saw some guy. She said, "Hey, I went to kindergarten with you." The guy was like, whoa, I'm 40 years old. And it turns out, yes, they had gone to kindergarten together. And she recognized him from when he was 5 years old. Now, nobody can program a computer to do that. Someday someone will, right? But that's unbelievable. Why? Because people look incredibly different. Right? Even seeing somebody after a couple of years, they look so different. Right? That's why we can't program computers to do facial recognition. Right? So someday we will, but these things are incredibly hard. Right? Or you can look at YouTubes of people trying to get robots to walk on bipedal locomotion on an uneven surface. is, again, an incredibly difficult computational problem. All right, so there's a lot of people said, intuition is totally underestimated. Look, it's actually totally amazing. And from a kind of computer sciencey perspective, that's absolutely right. Intuition is a lot more complicated than we gave it credit for. There's also been a development of this line of thinking, which is somewhat pernicious. And that has to do with people applying this now to the political realm. And in many ways, this is something you'll all be familiar with, because this has become a lot of the new common sense, or the received wisdom in politics, is that fundamentally it's about intuition. Right? So here we have the classic commitment to heart over head. And there are people saying, look, they're looking at the psychology literature, they're saying, look at the amazing power of intuition. And look how pathetic and underpowered rationality is. And then we turn to the political realm and we say, aha. So when it comes to determining people's behavior, we might think it's about head. We might think it's about policy positions. But what it's really about is heart, right? It's about how people are feeling. And so this idea of pitching policies to people at the rational level is basically a formula for losing elections. If you want to win elections, you have to appeal to people's hearts. So you get slogans like, heads you lose, hearts you win, stuff like that. All right, so this comes in both left-wing and right-wing flavors. So on the left, we have George Lakoff, made a big splash with the Democratic Party in the United States, basically saying to them, look, the problem you people are having is you're not framing your positions in an emotionally compelling way. So the high water mark of this supposed democratic failure was Michael Dukakis's famous answer about capital punishment in the presidential debates, where he was asked a very emotionally charged question, and he gave a very kind of clinical policy wonky answer, right? And it was like, oh, that just totally killed him, right? And then on the right, we have Frank Luntz, strategist advisor to the Republican Party in the United States, somewhat more successful practitioner of this particular dark art, saying, again, his slogan is, it's not about what you say, it's about how you make people feel. Right? So communications is about making you feel. He invented a lot of what's become our everyday political terminology. And so some of his favorite examples of this, it's all about creating emotional resonance. So he says, don't call it drilling for oil. Call it energy exploration, right? Because oil is dirty, right? Oil is just gunk in your car. Energy, who doesn't love energy, right? That's what keeps the lights on and so on, right? So this is his line of reasoning. All right, so both of these have contributed to a political environment that is often characterized as being dominated by truthiness, or what's sometimes called the post-truth political environment. Right? Because what it says is that political communication is not about the literal truth or falsity of what you're saying. It's about making people feel a certain way. So if you say something that's not true, that doesn't really matter so much because it might have a deeper emotional truth. Right? So the idea that truth and falsity matter is really a focus on the head. Right? It's people focusing on head. And that's not what the game's about. The game's about hearts. And when you're appealing to people's hearts, you're telling parables, right? Or as, Ronald Reagan was sort of the innovator in this area. So when people complained about him lying all the time, his, at the time, communication strategist, David Gergen, said, well, presidential storytelling is a time-honored American folk art. That was his defense, right? So, don't take it as a factual claim, right? It's folk art. Okay, so everybody knows what I'm talking about, right? So this is a common feature now of our political environment. So what I want to do is I want to register an objection to this. And I want to say that all of this stuff I've told you about intuition being incredibly powerful is true. But intuition has a bit of a problem. And the problem with intuition is that it is full of bugs. In other words, it just makes mistakes. And there are very good reasons for that, because these intuitive heuristics, we call them, that is, their rules of thumb, were evolved to solve very specific problems in the environment of evolutionary adaptation. And in that environment, speed was very, very important. And so accuracy was important, but there's always a trade-off between speed and accuracy. What evolution gave us was a set of tricks and shortcuts to make extremely rapid decisions, like to catch a coffee cup, but that sometimes that are good enough for practical purposes. But they also sometimes make mistakes. Right? And that's the central problem with intuition, is that it contains straight-up bugs. And because it's not available to consciousness, we can't reprogram it. So when we discover that there are these bugs in our system of judgment, we can't go and fix it the way I can if it's an argument on paper. All we can do is monitor ourselves and try to identify the circumstances in which we're likely to make a mistake, and then rationally override our System 1 responses. So the concept of a bug, just like in a computer program, right? Your brain is full of bugs. So let me give you an example of this, a really, really clear-cut example then of exactly what I mean by a bug. All right, so here's a picture. So my son drew this picture. And he was very excited. I commissioned this from him. But he's super excited that I'm going to show his picture in Ottawa. He got a little bit less excited when I told him why I was going to show this picture. Because it contains a mistake. And what I want to do is talk about the mistake. All right, so we have what's called a system of intuitive physics. And our system of intuitive physics is what allows us to do things like catch coffee cups that are falling. Namely, it allows us to project ballistic trajectories. And it's been shown that this has strong innate components. You can take, 2-month-old babies, and they can tell the difference between something that's going to hit them in the head and something that's going to pass over their shoulder. All right, so we have built-in capacities for anticipating trajectories. And it's extremely robust. It works perfectly. I mean, it's a legacy of having evolved on this planet, that it's exactly adapted to the atmospheric conditions and the gravity of this planet. It doesn't work underwater, right? It works in the air on this planet. And it works extremely well and very, very fast. But it has bugs. And so one really famous bug is called the straight-down fallacy. So what our intuitive physics tells us is that if you drop something, it goes straight down. But if you throw something, then the momentum is preserved as it falls, and it will travel in an arc. So that's how intuitive physics works. That's extremely useful. But the bug is that if you yourself are in motion when you drop something, your intuitive physics says that that thing travels straight down. But because you are in motion, it actually continues to travel forward. So this shows up in a variety of ways. And one of them is that kids draw airplanes bombing people incorrectly. My son was drawing a castle, and I said, hey, how about an airplane bombing the castle? And so he pointed out that that was anachronistic. And I said, just do it, right? All right, but so here's the mistake. And so sure enough, he made the mistake, right? He draws the bomb going straight down. Right, so that's the straight-down fallacy. That's a bug in our intuitive physics. Now, the catapult, he did that totally by himself, and I'm happy he did it, right? Because there you can see the contrast. With the catapult, he has the arc, right? So he has the trajectory right. But in the case of the bomb, he has it wrong. Okay, so this is a very famous bug in our hardware. And what's striking about it is that no matter how much physics you study, you'll never get rid of it. So they've done nifty studies on college students showing that, graduating students with engineering degrees, more than half of them still make this mistake. Why? Because your brain makes it for you if you're not paying attention. And you have to catch yourself. You have to remember, oh yeah, bombs don't fall straight down, or what have you. Right? So there's a couple of these. So this is an example of some of the really interesting work that's been done in cognitive science in the last couple decades of starting to discover these bugs that exist in our System 1 or intuitive problem-solving competencies. Now, what I want to suggest, and the reason I wanted to really emphasize the way these bugs work, is that we also have bugs in our system of cognition for dealing with social interactions. We have a huge number of psychological adaptations that are designed for dealing with other people. And those systems we have for dealing with other people also contain straight-up bugs. So this is, I'll explain this to you in a minute, but this is the big idea that I want to leave with you. Is that what I want to say? So we have a lot of dispositions which are intended to help us organize cooperative interactions with people. So compared to other primates, we have a lot of pro-social dispositions. Right? We're able to get along a lot better than chimpanzees. We're able to cooperate far more effectively than other primates. But the structure of our intuitions in this regard tend to create systems of cooperation which are not scalable. In other words, they reflect the fact that in the environment of evolutionary adaptation, we lived in very small-scale societies, and in particular, we'd never interacted with strangers. Right? That is, that in the environment of evolutionary adaptation, you would have known everyone with whom you interacted. And so we have cooperative dispositions that allow us to cooperate, but they also tend to limit the scale of cooperation. And so what it does is it creates institutions and societies that are not scalable. And what that means is you can't just add more people and expect the whole thing to keep on functioning as you scale it up. we have innate dispositions that limit the scale of social interactions. So I give you very quickly like 3 examples of bugs in our hardware. That's an exaggeration, but work with me, okay? So bugs in your hardware. Number 1, we treat harm to identifiable individuals as more important than harm to unidentified individuals. So if you do something that hurts somebody, just knowing who it is you're hurting makes you treat it as being more morally significant or salient. Number 2, we treat harm which is diffused over many people as being less important than harm that's imposed upon a single person. Right? I mean, to jump ahead, that's why it's trouble getting people excited about white-collar crime, for example. It's because the harm is diffused over many people. Right? There's no widow, who you can put on the stand and say, I lost everything. So that diffusion of harm also tends to reduce its moral significance. Now, both of those mean that as group sizes get larger, the chances of there being a stranger affected by your action increases, and as a result, people become more inclined to engage in antisocial behavior. The third one, and this is a really significant one, is that we have systems of punishment that enforce cooperation. That is, when you see somebody breaking the rules, taking advantage of other people, free riding, we have a strong impulse to punish that person. And if we're not able to punish that person, then people respond by withdrawing cooperation. Right? So it's like, look, if that person's not going to play along, I'm not playing along either, right? If people aren't lining up for the food, I'm not going to line up for the food either, right? So that's how people... So systems of cooperation tend to unravel in a very characteristic way, which is at the beginning, people are often willing to do their part. But then they see somebody who's not doing his or her part and getting away with it. And then they say, oh, well, I'm not doing it either. And then it unravels. Now, that also limits scalability, because in a small group, it will often be the case that nobody will free ride. But as you add more people, the chances that somebody somewhere is going to be free riding increases. And as soon as people see even that one person doing it, they all get that response like, okay, I'm not doing it either, right? So again, that limits scalability. All right, so, all these dispositions, it seems, would dramatically limit the size of human societies, right? But obviously, we live in complex societies. We live in large-scale complex societies. So how is that possible? And the answer is, we override these bugs. The same way with the bomb dropping, right? You identify the circumstance in which your intuition is going to get it wrong, and you either personally override it, or better yet, we create institutions that have as their function overriding these maladaptive dispositions that we have from our environment or our sort of evolutionary prehistory. So to wrap it up, what I want to suggest is that Trudeau was fundamentally right in the insight that he was presenting, which is that certain institutional arrangements like federalism that have as their function promoting cooperation in a large-scale society fundamentally do depend upon reason. They depend not just on a rational insight, but they actually depend upon a rational override of our more basic dispositions, right? It really does have to be reason over intuition in these circumstances, right? Because we have these maladaptive impulses. And that is what creates, I think, a very difficult choice for us in our society. Because I think there's absolutely no question that there is currently a dynamic at work in our democracy which is increasingly crowding out these kinds of appeals to reason. Right? So there has been a shift away from head towards heart that we're all familiar with. And it's important to recognize that situation is fundamentally not sustainable. So a democracy in which it's just all demagoguery all the time, right, is not a stable political system. And a situation in which heart wins over head consistently is not compatible with maintaining a large-scale civilization, or it's not compatible with maintaining a democracy. So what I really want to emphasize, or suggest, sort of press upon you, is that I think there's been a terrible mistake to treat this heart over head stuff as though it were just a fact of human nature. Like that's just how it is, that you appeal to people's hearts, not their heads, right? That's actually not a fact of human nature. In fact, that's really in tension with the fundamental principles of our civilization. It's a situation that we have allowed to develop and that we are allowing to continue. But we should never imagine that this is just the way it is, right? These are clearly consequences of choices that have been made. Okay, so how do you fix it? Well, that's a much longer story. I haven't got time. So I have this book that I'm pitching. Enlightenment 2.0, Pitching a Return to Reason. Not available until April, but when it's available, I mean, so, you know, reason is slow, and it took me 350 pages to really explain this properly. But for the moment, then, so let me just say, I invite you to take a look at that. And for the moment, though, I thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Joe. That was a totally intriguing presentation. We do have time for questions, and I can see you found the microphone in the center of the room. Vous pouvez poser des questions en anglais ou en français, as you prefer. Whichever language you use, please tell us who you are, and if you can try and keep your questions short so we can get as many people in as possible. Thank you.
My name is Bruce Heyer. I'm the MP for Thunder Bay. I operate in an intuitive way, but I try to pretend that I'm rational. I think most of us do that. I found a very great talk. Thank you. It was very stimulating. I'm awake now. That was terrific. I see a flaw in it, and it is in our Canadian system that we always seem to compromise, or we usually seem to compromise. And so the idea that intuition is not necessarily correct, so when you have two strong opinions that are different, and then you find the compromise, you either make nobody happy or you're just plain wrong. And the example I would use is climate change. 99.9% of all scientists now say that we probably are causing climate change, and it's desperate, and the Earth and civilization will terminate if we don't fix it. And yet, because 1% of the scientists and 40% of the population believe the other side, we get stuck in the compromise mode where we don't really do anything about it. So is that not an inherent flaw in your thesis, and how do you deal with that?
Thank you. Well, I would suggest that it illustrates the limitations. I mean, cooperation is incredibly difficult to organize, and climate change is the perfect. I mean, people call it the mother of all collective action problems, and that's a good description. I mean, so collective action problem is a case where, by not cooperating, we all make ourselves worse off in the end. Right? And so we all need to emit less carbon. But then it's a matter of organizing that. And there you start to see the limitations of our human capacities for cooperation, simply because exactly the dynamic of unraveling that I had mentioned occurs with equal force with climate change, which is that people... So I actually, the debates over the science... don't strike me as being the most important sort of locus of disagreement. I mean, often, like you poll Americans and 50% say, oh, I don't believe in climate change. I think that's just a polite way of saying, I want to drive my SUV, right? So I don't take the stuff about the belief in the science, those debates really seriously. I think the fundamental dynamic there is one of collective action, which is that 7 billion of us have to get on the same page, and we all have to agree to limit ourselves from free riding. Right? Because we all derive personal advantages from driving cars, from doing all these carbon-intensive activities. And what happens, though, I mean, trying to get 7 billion people to cooperate is incredibly difficult, precisely because of this dynamic. As soon as a couple people aren't doing their job, you say, aha, well, I'm not doing it either. And so there's been a huge dynamic like that between rich world and poor world, and about Kyoto and so on, where people are saying, well, why should we do it if they're not doing it? And they'll just use up the space that we don't use, and so as long as they're not doing it, I'm not going to do it. I mean, that's an entirely self-destructive pattern of reasoning, because as long as you're not doing it, they're not going to do it. I mean, that's the fundamental problem, right? Now, what's important to recognize, though, is that we are not wired up to... I mean, so there is... Certain environmentalists sometimes think that if people just knew, right? Like if everybody saw Al Gore's film, they would just go out and do it, right? But actually, everybody can know what the problem is and still not do anything about it because of this underlying bug that leads us to defect. And we have all kinds of tricks that we use, institutional arrangements like the market, like the state, that allow us to cooperate despite the fact that we're not really committed to cooperation. But at the global level, we don't have those kinds of institutions. Right? So with respect to climate change, I take it to be totally a practical problem of getting people organized and cooperating. And I think it's a really open question whether or not we as a species are actually even capable of cooperating at that level.
Thank you. My name is Charles Kazam. I'd like to ask you where you think the bug is, where across the river passion and demagoguery are sold as reason when trying to sell the secularism charter.
Well, I mean, sorry, I guess I didn't get the force of the question. I mean, I think that's what's going on. I mean, I think that there was, a pretense for a very long time that many people in Quebec were very committed to, that their form of nationalism was a type of civic nationalism, right? So, I mean, I remember being shocked when I first moved to Quebec, seeing at the Saint Jean-Baptiste parade people with signs saying "Le Québec aux Québécois." I was a little shocked by that, saying, well, isn't that a little xenophobic? People, no. Anybody who lives in Quebec is Québécois, right? So the sign's totally inoffensive because, it's just true by definition. The moment you land here, right? So I was like, well, then, if that were true, like, why would you have a sign? Like you don't need to have a sign if it's like analytically true. So it's a kind of dog whistle there, right? But I mean, for a very long time, people were able to very deeply convince themselves that it was a very kind of civic and open-minded nationalism that was all just about territory and so on. And I think that pretense, and I think it was a pretense, and that there was a lot of self-deception amongst many people of good faith, but nevertheless there was self-deception there. I mean, there really isn't such a thing as civic nationalism that's able to really motivate people to make sacrifices and so forth. So I think that pretense has been dropped. It's become clear that that the core of the nationalist movement is one of ethnic and linguistic solidarity. So it's gotten a little bit nastier, but also certain things I think have been clarified.
Okay, thank you.
Bonjour, Raymond Côté, député de Beauport-Limoilou. C'était une conférence tout à fait fascinante, puis ça a permis de répondre à mes propres frustrations vis-à-vis justement des intuitions erronées qui nous amènent dans divers chemins. Je vais vous amener du côté de l'économie puis des conséquences des 30-35 dernières années là, de déréglementation, de baisse d'impôts, de taxes qui ont pensablement massacré la classe moyenne et qui n'empêche pas une bonne partie de la classe moyenne de croire encore que la solution, c'est d'encore baisser les impôts, les taxes et tout ça. J'ai un background comme historien. Ce qui m'intéresse, c'est d'avoir une explication ou de vous amener sur le terrain des 30 Glorieuses, alors qu'on sortait d'une période de grande perturbation avec la grande crise, la Seconde Guerre mondiale, la guerre de Corée, où là, au contraire, on avait un élan de solidarité particulièrement fort qui a amené la mise en place de grands programmes sociaux, la construction d'une société beaucoup plus solidaire, beaucoup plus conforme, on pourrait dire, à la raison, mais qui pouvait probablement s'expliquer par aussi une part d'intuition liée aux épreuves qui ont été vécues. Sans vouloir être un partisan de vivre un nouvel épisode de misère lié à ça, quelles leçons on pourrait tirer de cette époque-là qui nous avait permis un réel progrès social?
Eh bien, je partage absolument la frustration que vous exprimez. Il me semble que, en ce qui concerne les impôts, les gens, en général, ont des attitudes assez irrationnelles. Et la seule chose que j'aimerais porter à la discussion, c'est il y a souvent l'idée sur la gauche qu'il faut seulement comme mieux s'exprimer. Alors, on a tous ces projets publics qu'on pourra obtenir. Bon, je vis à Toronto, alors chacun qui passe, ça me prend 10 minutes davantage d'arriver au travail parce que la circulation est complètement bloquée. Mais il semble incapable de faire des investissements dans l'infrastructure, dans le transport en commun, des choses comme ça. Alors moi, et pourquoi? Parce que il faudrait augmenter un peu les impôts. Bon, il y a un certain point de vue qui dit, le problème, c'est que la gauche n'a pas bien expliqué sa position ou n'a pas donné comme le framing, tu sais, alors ne l'a pas présenté d'une façon émotionnelle. Moi, ce que j'aimerais suggérer, c'est que la raison pour laquelle on n'a jamais présenté d'une façon assez émotionnelle, c'est qu'on ne peut pas le faire. Parce qu'il y a un certain problème d'action collective et la seule chose qu'on peut faire, c'est expliquer aux gens. Quand on regarde la circulation qui est complètement bloquée, on peut dire à des gens, regarde, les gens ne sont pas forcés de se mettre en voiture le matin. Si il y a le transport en commun, il y aura moins de voitures. Alors, si vous payez davantage pour l'utilisation des rues, la circulation ne sera bloquée. Alors, ça donne des avantages à ceux dans les voitures et à ceux qui... Bon, alors il y a la longue histoire qu'il faut expliquer. Alors ça, moi je pense qu'il n'y a aucune façon de le présenter d'une façon comme émotionnelle. Mais notre mère, quand elle dit « Ah, il y a une guerre contre la voiture qu'il faut terminer », là, c'est quelque chose d'assez émotionnel. Alors, il y a un désavantage dans certaines positions. Alors, moi, ce que j'aimerais suggérer, c'est que la seule chose qu'on peut faire, c'est il faut changer l'environnement. On ne peut pas faire seulement avec une meilleure stratégie de communication. Il faut changer l'environnement de discours pour que la raison peut l'emporter. Comment faire ça? Un problème extrêmement difficile. Alors, je l'ai présenté un peu comme une blague, mais j'ai écrit tout un livre en essayant de travailler un peu sur ce problème-là, parce que ça me semble être un problème très, très difficile. Alors, j'ai quelques suggestions, mais il n'y a pas de solution magique à tout ça.
Hi, my name is Nicole Ritzer. I'm with Senate Communications. And I was just wondering if you can speak a little bit about the effects of anonymity on what you call the defection bug. It seems to me that anonymity is very easily achieved in this digital age, I suppose. And I was just wondering if it's possible to achieve, that sense of community and cooperation as individuals increasingly anonymize.
Yeah. Well, I mean, anonymity has a disinhibiting effect that's been widely noted. I mean, a lot of people noticed it with the internet. I always noticed it in traffic as well, because as soon as you get in a car, you become anonymous in a certain way. And then people's pro-social dispositions tend to decline once they get in the car, right? So you get a lot more antisocial behavior in cars. So I'd always thought with cars that, I mean, so it'll change when the cars can talk to each other, right? And then you can just send messages to the person in front of you saying, "Why are you behaving this way?" So, I mean, there's ways in which technology can reduce anonymity, but there's also ways, obviously, in which it enhances anonymity. But I guess what's crucial is that we can't depend upon always de-anonymizing interactions, simply because we live in vast and large-scale societies. And it is true that when this advice on how not to flame people by email, they always say, well, imagine you're speaking to the person face-to-face, and then don't write anything in an email that you wouldn't say to the person face-to-face, right? So that's a way of kind of getting your brain to behave the way you want your brain to behave. But that's not a feasible model for the way in which people should think about their social obligations in general. And that's why we have an enormous number of social institutions that just impose rules on people's behavior. And so, I mean, and they constrain us in various ways. I mean, there's lots of examples of this in criminal justice. Like, criminal justice is a really good area because people have very strong intuitions and dispositions that tend to be actually quite dysfunctional in large-scale societies. So we have rules. And we have rules like, for example, the presumption of innocence. Right? And that's just a rule that we have, which is very unintuitive because, we all know he's guilty. Right? Like you look at it and say, guilty. Right? But we have this presumption of innocence, very, very artificial. That's a classic kind of System 2 override of our System 1 impulses. Now, so that means we don't have to go through a thing of saying, well, imagine if you were in that person's shoes. Imagine if you were unjustly accused of a crime you hadn't committed, right? I mean, you could try to personalize it, but people's sympathy is extremely limited. And so instead of trying to personalize it, we have an abstract rule that says presumed innocent until proven guilty. And then we follow that rule. But what that means is that if the way in which we're thinking about criminal justice policy and debating it is always emotionally charged, then that rule and the justification for that rule, which is kind of an abstract rational justification, gets drowned out in the noise, right? And so we start to erode that kind of principled constraint on our behavior when we have these highly, highly emotionally charged debates about these kinds of questions. Right? So I actually think that, I mean, anonymity is a huge problem, but the solution to anonymity is not personalizing things. It's the rational insight that we can have into the way institutions should be organized.
Bonjour, mon nom est Denis Blanchette, je suis le député de Louis-Hébert. Merci pour votre présentation. Je pense qu'en politique, l'objectif, c'est toujours d'être capable de se connecter aux gens. La raison, c'est la voie difficile. l'émotion, c'est la voie facile, avec des résultats à court terme. Ce que je dirais, c'est que quand on décide de faire une politique uniquement basée sur l'émotion, tout ce qu'on va avoir, c'est une société divisée pour longtemps, irréconciliable. Si on est juste dans la raison, on perd les gens. L'analogie que je ferais, c'est que, comme on est dans les Olympiques, parlons de hockey 2 minutes, hein? Une équipe émotive sans talent, ça va pas bien loin. Une équipe rationnelle sans émotion, ça va pas bien loin. Je pense que la journée qu'on est capable de mettre ensemble la raison et l'émotion au service d'une cause, je pense qu'on peut aller beaucoup plus loin. Oui,
merci beaucoup. Un des aspects de toute cette recherche que j'ai présenté brièvement sur l'intuition est un grand changement qu'on a eu entre le temps de Trudeau et le temps de maintenant, c'est que l'ancienne perspective de l'âge des Lumières, c'était que la raison devra complètement l'emporter sur l'émotion. Alors, on devra faire la substitution. Alors, n'importe quoi qui a été fait par l'émotion, on va le remplacer par la raison. Alors, nous deviendrons des créatures complètement rationnelles et tout ça. Alors, il n'y a personne qui croit que cela est possible. Alors, nous avons beaucoup plus de respect pour l'aspect émotionnel ou l'intuition parce qu'on voit que, d'une perspective computationnelle, il y a toutes sortes de choses qu'on peut seulement faire avec l'intuition. Alors, il n'y a plus personne qui veut que la raison remplace complètement l'intuition. Alors, c'est absolument comme vous dites, c'est question de trouver une balance entre les deux. Mais pour le moment, je pense que il y a eu trop d'emphase sur l'intuition. Alors, l'aspect que on a fait toutes ces découvertes, on a trouvé que, bon, on pensait qu'il y avait ce boîte, il y avait comme une petite machine là-dedans qui faisait quelque chose, mais on a découvert que c'était un énorme engin complètement complexe qui faisait toutes sortes de choses miraculeuses. Alors, mais on a mis un peu trop d'emphase sur cet aspect-là. Alors, moi, je suis absolument d'accord qu'il faut y avoir une balance entre les deux, mais la balance doit être que la raison doit être toujours capable de détecter les erreurs qui existent dans l'autre système. Parce que le premier système n'est pas capable d'avoir la conscience de soi, de voir quand il est en train de faire des erreurs. Ça doit toujours être la raison qui a le travail de faire la supervision de l'autre système. Alors, je suis absolument d'accord, mais il doit y avoir une balance entre les deux, équilibre.
Hi. Thanks very much. For a very provoking way of looking at behavior. But you haven't mentioned, I don't think you've mentioned, ethics or ethical behavior vis-a-vis how we live together in society, and the fact that there are huge power differentials within our society, not just in Canada, but globally, and that affects the balance between how intuition is the System 1 and System 2 are played out because people or groups with the resources to exploit the intuitive approach are able to exercise that power over others. And, I don't think you're suggesting that ethics is on the rational side and selfishness and greed is on the non-rational side, but where would that fit in?
So I do take ethics to be primarily on the rational side, in the sense that I think that most of the moral rules that we follow in our day-to-day life are actually solve collective action problems. In other words, what they do is create systems of cooperation. And so your classic triumvirate, don't lie, don't cheat, don't steal, recommend themselves to us because when nobody lies, cheats, or steals, we're all better off. So I think there is actually a deep connection between morality and cooperation. Now, morality has some certain evolutionary precursors so that we have feelings of sympathy and there is an emotional element to it. But I actually am a rationalist with respect to morality, in that I think that things like how would you like it if everybody does that or did that has an enormous amount of force. So I actually think that morality is primarily on the rational side of things.
Could I just have a question really quick?
I'm in the hands of my supervisors here, and I understand that we are going to have to wind up the formal session. I'm not sure if Joe might be able to stay back and speak with a couple of others. Thank you so much, and thanks to you for the wonderful questions. I wanted to thank James Rajat, MP from Edmonton-Leduc. Is he in the room? It's thanks to him that we're able to host these breakfasts in this gorgeous parliamentary dining room. So thanks very much to him. Joe, we have a small token of our appreciation for that wonderful lecture and conversation. Thanks again to the Trudeau Foundation. Thanks again to the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. I hope that you've all are going to stay tuned for the next Big Thinking lecture. It's on March 4th, same time, same place. And the topic it's Lauren Dawson from the University of Waterloo. Why do some Canadians become terrorists? Promises to be very interesting also. Thank you so much for coming, and bonne journée à tous.